Welcome, everybody, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to moderate this session, which represents the first official event of the Center of Competence for Sustainable Finance. I don't want to take any time to the speakers. We have many panelists. The main challenge is to handle the time. So let's start immediately with the Director of the Department of Banking and Finance, Marc Chenet, who will give us a bit of the background of about the center. Marc.
Thank you, Stefano. Let me go there. Okay. So indeed, my colleague Stefano Battiston and I are delighted to welcome you all to this afternoon session. The moment we have all been waiting for has come. After months of academic as well as administrative work, preparation, and meetings, you name it, with the strong support of the University of Zurich, of the Dean's Office. Today is finally the D-Day, the launch of the Center of Competence for Sustainable Finance. The University of Zurich has a tradition in terms of teaching and research activities in sustainable finance, and will become, with this center, a key player in this field. We're also delighted and honored to welcome the Nobel laureate, Professor Joseph Stiglitz, who is visiting the University of Zurich on the occasion of our conference on climate change and financial risk, and who will be our keynote speaker later this afternoon. It will be the climax of this conference and of the center launch. He will be talking about how climate change affects our economies and the distribution of wealth, and the reasons for which the financial sector should seek to integrate scientific knowledge into their assessment of risk related to climate. The creation of this center is an achievement for the whole team involved in this process. And at this point, I would like to take the opportunity to thank all of them for their work and dedication. It is now the beginning of a new phase. We have gained visibility, and we should continue to deliver in terms of teaching and research activities. What is our mission in terms of teaching and research activities? Create new courses and programs, and more broadly, answer to the growing demand from the student side. We will develop a minor in this field, and possibly, who knows, a master's program in the long run. We also strive to generate high-level and interdisciplinary research activities. This is an ambitious goal. 3 centers will be regrouped under the umbrella of this ambitious Center for Competence, namely the Center for Responsibility and Finance, led by Professor Carmen Tanner, the Center for Sustainable Finance and Private Wealth, led by Dr. Falco Petzol, Dr. Annette Kraus, and by me, and the Phoenix Center for Financial and Networks and Sustainability, led by Stefano Battiston. The idea is to generate synergies and to broaden the scope of our activities. Allow me to briefly introduce the team. You see here a long list of names from various faculties and departments. You see, so our Faculty of Business, Economics and Informatics. So the 4 departments are represented here: Banking and Finance, Informatics, Business Administration, Economics. The Faculty of Law is also represented, Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, Faculty of Science. I think it's a good signal. This diversity augurs well from the future and should allow for fruitful interactions. One important feature of this Center of Competence is interdisciplinarity. Indeed, there is no sustainability in economics and finance without interdisciplinarity. This issue of sustainability has so many dimensions and facets that standard one-dimensional concepts are often too limited. An example is the choice of the discount rate. This choice is not purely financial. It is a quite tricky issue. With a high discount rate, future catastrophes discounted today are negligible. The choice of the discount rate should reflect the interest of future generations. It should encompass the economic as well as the political, sociological, legal, and moral dimensions. Here is the organigram. We hope that Professor Joseph Stiglitz will accept to chair the so-called advisory board, the BIRAT. With the creation of this center, the UZH shows that it assumes its responsibilities vis-à-vis taxpayers, students, and society in general. Global warming is a major challenge our society is confronted with. Here, just a few figures to illustrate the magnitude of the problem. Over time, in 1 century, between 1950 and 2015, it is expected that the world population will multiply by 4, the GDP by at least 20, and if we want the Paris COP21 agreements of 2015 to be respected, that is to say, if the increase in global temperature at the end of the century is to be limited to plus 1.5 degrees Celsius, global CO2 emissions in 2050 should be much smaller than those of 1950. This is precisely a major challenge. Solutions should be implemented as soon as possible. It is the responsibility of current generations to address this issue and to take into account the interest of future generations. What is the nature of the solutions? Is technical progress the answer to this problem? It is part of the solution, but obviously it is not enough. We need new mindsets and the development of new concepts, and this is precisely what this new center endeavors to deliver. At least this is our objective. Without further ado, I will now give the floor to Stefano Battiston, who will moderate this afternoon session, and more information here.
Thank you, Mark.
You're welcome.
So we continue now with a panel conversation, and what is special about this panel is that we have faculty members from different faculties of the university, different departments, and of course, not everybody that is in the organigram could be fit physically on a panel, so somehow we're happy that we have some of those, and they will provide their perspective of why do we need a Center for Sustainable Finance at the University of Zurich, what they have been already working on themselves, and what they will plan to work on, especially in particular, hopefully in collaboration with across the faculty. So I will start with Kern Alexander from the Faculty of Law.
There we go. Thank you, Stefano, and might borrow the. See if we, here we are. Okay. There we are, great, excellent. Thank you, Stefano. Also, thank you, Professor Chenet and the other organizers of today's event. It's a pleasure for me to be here and to speak very generally, very briefly about some of the projects in the Faculty of Law that are addressing sustainable finance from a legal and a regulatory perspective. So at the beginning, though, when we think about law, we have to be somewhat careful, because law reform in any area, especially in the area of financial regulation, can be a complex, difficult, and drawn-out process. And I think that that's certainly the case in the area of how to regulate the financial risks that relate to environmental sustainability. And so, this is a slide that kind of says, if we wait for law reform in this area, it might be too late. And I guess the overarching theme I'd like to make is that in analyzing what the role of law and regulation is, we should think about existing legal frameworks, existing regulatory rules and standards and think about how we can more creatively apply them to achieve broader financial policy objectives rather than going through the complexities of trying to enact new treaties or new laws. Now, let's see. Now, in the law faculty, I don't speak for everyone, but some of the main areas of research that we have been working on involve looking at the role of banks, banking regulation, the corporate governance of banks, and also the regulation of banks to see how banks can be incentivized to allocate more credit for sustainable economic activity. Another area of research is looking at the regulation of investment, the regulation of asset management companies, and how the interpretation of fiduciary duties can be made in a way that enables asset managers, investors, to invest money on behalf of beneficiaries to help the transition to a low-carbon economy. Another area of research we're looking at is how to achieve financial inclusion. So not so much on environmental sustainability, but looking at social sustainability. Of course, many countries in the world, especially developing countries, have challenges regarding financial inclusion. And so what we're looking at is how digital finance can be regulated in a way to enhance financial inclusion. And we are also looking separately at a project of EU law about how European Union banking law and investment regulation can be designed in a way to achieve sustainability objectives. And in particular, it's looking at the European Commission proposal on taxonomies, the classifications of different economic sectors as sustainable or not sustainable, and seeing how that might be implemented into the current bank capital regulatory framework, this Capital Requirements Directive 5, and also the MiFID directive on the regulation of financial products and the regulation of asset management investment policies. And then finally, I'll make just a few words about a newly formed research network for sustainable finance that brings together universities and research institutes across Europe and internationally to try to address sustainability challenges from an interdisciplinary perspective, from both economics, finance, other areas of the social sciences, law, and even areas of the natural sciences. So I'll just say a few words very quickly about that. But before I begin, Stefano wanted me to mention a report that I was the author of in 2014 called Stability and Sustainability in Banking Reform. It was published by Cambridge University Press, and it was a report that was commissioned by the United Nations Environment Program, in which we studied how the Basel Capital Accord could be applied in a way to try to incentivize banks to provide more credit for sustainable economic activity. And essentially, our four main points in the report were that history demonstrates links between systemic environmental risk and banking instability, that the Basel Accord currently does not adequately address environmental systemic risk, and then the report conducts an empirical review of regulatory practices of countries outside of the Basel Committee to show that many countries in the world are addressing environmental sustainability and systemic risk in creative, innovative ways, and that the Basel Committee should take the experiences of these countries on board and revise Basel III to take account of this. And then that the Basel Accord where it's revised, it should focus on risk governance and corporate governance of banks under Pillar 2, and also looking at Pillar 3, the market discipline, part of the accord that deals with the disclosure of risk to the market. So that's where we think the most reforms could be made. Now also that report led to another report that I was a part of that was commissioned by the the G20 and its Green Finance Study Group in 2016, when China was the president of the G20. And basically, this initiative consisted of 3 reports that analyzed how the banking sector, how governance in the banking sector from the banking side, as well as what regulators should be doing to try to incentivize banks to meet a broader set of sustainability objectives. So it was an empirical research. We reviewed the experience of banks by conducting interviews, collecting data on their current risk management models, and also reviewed the experience of regulators, what regulators are doing to regulate sustainability risk. And then coming up with some common practices and generally accepted practices of regulators across the G20 countries, and based on that, making policy proposals for reform of banking regulation. And so that was a G20 report. Now, also at the law faculty now, there is a research project that is looking at the role of regulating digital finance to achieve financial inclusion. So this is looking at social sustainability. And this paper aims at how to balance innovation and risk to achieve financial inclusion objectives, and makes policy recommendations about how these technologies can be regulated while avoiding some of the downside risk. Special attention is given to the role of central banks in facilitating the regulation of digital finance, and also explores possible global coordination in this area. Other Zurich law academics, and some of them are here today in the audience, are looking at the role of pension funds and how they should be regulated in promoting the transition to a low-carbon environment. Another colleague has published an article on corporate social responsibility and how it can be done in a way to help achieve other social sustainability objectives. And finally, the last slide deals with the Research Network for Sustainable Finance that was launched in 2019. And this, as I said, is a network of universities in Europe and internationally that will bring together academics and policy makers and researchers to explore how sustainable finance objectives and sustainability more generally can be promoted from a financial policy perspective. So anyway, in a nutshell, those are some of the initiatives that are going on. Thank you, Professor Battiston and Professor Chenet, for inviting me to be on the panel today.
It's the turn now of Annette Kraus to give us a sense of on the education side.
Thank you, Stefano. Thank you, Karen. Mark. The Center of Competence includes a focus on teaching. That's a little unusual for competence centers at the university. I'm happy to talk about why we think this is important and how the center will hopefully help us to advance teaching in sustainable finance. The Center of Competence is a cornerstone to be able to do that. Sustainable finance is a new field. We don't have a standard academic textbook canon that we can give into teachers' hands and say, please teach this. So we're working on building a field in research and in teaching. And the setup of the Competence Center is quite ideal to do that and to go beyond and advance the existing initiatives. Mark mentioned that we already have a history of teaching. I'm glad to say that the International Finance Law class is on our list of classes. But we want to go beyond. We want to achieve the goal of offering a portfolio of academic, science-based teaching curricula and programs to a large number of target groups. University students, master students mostly, but also not forgetting bachelor and obviously promoting PhD research interest as well. And we also want to build on and advance the executive teaching in sustainable finance. The competence for this is quite important because it not only is rooted in academic research and science, which is our differentiating factor in teaching compared to practice-based teaching. It also brings this platform for interdisciplinarity. So, as Mark was mentioning, we already have something. We have worked hard with the faculty and the Dean's Office to be ready to offer a specialization in the master program with the next regulation reform. We have bachelor classes that increasingly address sustainability questions. Some of them in mandatory classes, some specialized classes. I'm proud to say we are the market leader in executive education with the first and a full certificate of advanced studies in sustainable finance, and specialized, strategically selected additional not-for-credit offers for executives and wealth owners. But the Center of Competence will help us to broaden and build on this, ensure the continuity of the programs, lay ground for a larger program, for instance in the master, thinking about talking with other disciplines, and making sure that when we advance the executive programs toward a Master of Advanced Studies, that we obviously continue to talk and interlink this with the finance executive education and the university strategy on executive education, but be able to talk to colleagues from other disciplines as well. So to sum up, I wanted to remind you of where you find information on what we already have on the website, and to remind of us our vision of science-based, applicable, and interdisciplinary teaching. Thank you.
Thank you, Annette. I have to ask you to accelerate a bit and keep to the core of the message. So now I think we have Markus Leipel.
So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk here. I only have 2 slides, which also reflects the fact that I'm more or less new to this kind of topic. My background is mathematical finance, and I thought for the rest of my life I'm going to teach investment bankers how they can optimize profits. But I think with having 2 small kids now, my focus has changed a little bit, and I think I have some kind of obligation to do something better than just maximizing profits. So I looked at climate physics, and I saw that climate science has advanced enormously over the recent years. Nevertheless, all these IPCC reports, they, at least up to 2013, they didn't really trigger anything in society because people were not aware of the imminent danger of climate change. So I think that tackling the climate problem is necessarily an interdisciplinary problem. Interdisciplinary because you don't change anything in the world when you don't influence where capital is flowing. And this is where economists and finance researchers have to live up to their obligation and provide something for this generation and also for future generations. Now it was interesting, like 2 days ago, the last resistance, I would say, in the financial market, namely BlackRock, admitted that the climate is actually changing. So therefore I added this quote here by Larry Fink. And I think this is good news to some extent. Maybe it's just greenwashing, so we have to be a little bit careful here. Greenwashing meaning that now it's really en vogue to talk about climate, and you really have to find out whether it's what they say is truly what they do. So I think it's necessary to have an interdisciplinary approach. And climate change, it's very easy, right? The problem is caused by economics. Climate is not changing because of natural emissions, it's because of man-made emissions, and therefore we are at the very center of the root of the problem and are able to tackle the problem with all the machineries that we have learned over the year. Now, one can think that you can have a very pessimistic view about the future, but I think there is some silver lining at the horizon, and the silver lining comes in the form of new advances in machine learning, artificial intelligence, and data science. We have an immense amount of data available these days, and I'm happy to currently be at Google as a visiting researcher and get some insights into what is actually possible to do. Of course, there's also some downside being at Google these days. So I've been 5 months there, and this morning I noticed that I don't fit in my suits, business suits anymore, because the food is for free there, and everybody gains weight at Google. So sorry for not wearing a suit today. So big data and computational methods are definitely a tool which will help to tackle the climate problem. My own research agenda will focus on kind of what I've been always doing, like finding asset prices or determining asset prices, but this time I include also the climate risk and see whether actually investors are taking care about climate risk, or and there's also some kind of interdisciplinary connection to what Kern has told you about regulation. Does regulation eventually bite, meaning that it helps to change how investors behave? And there are different methods you can use, from data science, natural language processing, and so on and so forth. And this will be my research agenda for the next 5 years, hopefully also together with collaboration from industry. Stop.
Thank you, Marcus. So it's now time to reconnect also to the natural sciences, and this is why we're very happy to have the Dean of the Faculty of Natural Sciences, Michael Shepard.
Thank you very much, Stefano. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure being here invited for this very interesting panel. Just to explain our focus, my background, I briefly would say I'm a space scientist, which is different from a rocket scientist. As a space scientist, I work for European Space Agency and NASA. We're building next generation instruments that are either airborne or spaceborne to map either conformity or compliance from space. Basically, we're looking at how biodiversity evolves over time and see whether this is compliant with international legislation. Now, this is not easy. You all know Photoshop. In remote sensing, you have a satellite which is transmitting down data on the Earth. You get images, everything can be photoshopped. So the question is, how does conformity be possible if you're working with data that can be easily manipulated? That's the reason why in legal cases, usually evidence from satellites is not yet fully accepted. It's a very interesting story where we work on the physical component of the Earth system. Alexa.
If this works. Well, I don't really need it. Anyways, in high school, usually having a last name that starts with W is an advantage because you get called on last. On a panel with distinguished speakers, not so much because you're last. I'm a financial economist as well. Like Marcus, we're in the same department. I don't think I need to motivate anybody here why the topic of climate finance and sustainable finance is important. Nonetheless, I brought this quote that is by a geochemist actually, but it's quoted by Marty Weitzman, who taught me environmental economics and micro during my PhD. Unfortunately, Marty tragically passed away last year. The climate system is an angry beast, and we're poking it with sticks. Now that has a clear environmental economics or environmental angle to it. It also has a clear economic angle to it, namely the notion that there are extreme outcomes we need to worry about. And finance is the study of risk. It's also the study of opportunities in the form of returns. Our hope is that finance can play a productive role. So for example, the Paris Agreement says in Article 2 that making financial flows consistent with the transition to the low-carbon economy is an important way forward. And so in our research, we're trying to contribute to that goal. Some of the outcomes are surprising. So for example, after the election of Donald Trump as president of the US, actually what happened was that climate-responsible stocks did better than their peers. That's contrary to what most people think if you ask them, but it turns out in the data that's true. What happened seems to have been that long-run investors recognized maybe there's going to be a big policy rebound that's going to come back and hit companies harder, so it's a good idea to actually invest into climate responsibility. Similarly, in another paper that I'm actually going to present tomorrow, so that's a small plug here for the academic sessions, a paper with two brilliant PhD students, Marco Ceccarelli and Stefano Ramelli, we're looking at mutual funds and how investors, but also managers of mutual funds, respond to an eco-label. In April 2018, Morningstar put out a low-carbon designation label. Right? And so they are hoping to make some business out of that, obviously. How do investors respond to that? Well, not surprisingly, investors like that label. Maybe also not so surprisingly, mutual funds actually respond to that, so they change their investments. But for us, from a perspective of financial economists, the question is that only good? You might think, yeah, that's great. Financial flows are going towards the good stuff, so to speak. But it turns out that investments, mutual funds that have this low carbon label are actually exposed to higher idiosyncratic risk. Why? Because you're less diversified. And so for an investor, sort of understanding the trade-offs involved in that is important. I mentioned these two things because they benefit from interactions with other faculties. I came here about 14 years ago because of the strong interdisciplinary focus of the university. Marc was the head of the recruiting committee back then, so thanks very much for that opportunity. Yeah, it was a good, really a fantastic opportunity to come here. Interdisciplinary is also going to be, I think, a key factor of this center. And I see many practitioners here, and I just want to call out to you, like I think everybody did, we are very open towards interactions, especially upstream interactions, in that sense that we're not going to try to produce research and then present it to you. Ideally, we have a conversation before about what are the useful questions that need answering. We're very open towards that, and then the center can be a huge success.
Okay, so thank you all to provide an insight on your perspective on sustainable finance. I think that my takeaway from this is essentially, you see, it's a challenge, but it's also there's also hope and clearly a need to reconnect finance in its various dimensions, corporate finance, mathematical finance, with various elements. On the one hand, you need to look into, well, what happened on the regulatory side, the legal aspects, because eventually finance can only bite, I mean, the risk metric can only bite if there is appropriate regulation in place. And on the other hand, in particular to avoid greenwashing, as you mentioned, well, there has to be a way to objectively verify that what people say is actually happening, and one of the ways you can do it is by basing those measurements and relying on the natural sciences. We don't have the time. Of course, this would open up, a lot of discussions. The goal of this panel was just to give you a glimpse, it was a teaser, make you curious, and we don't have the time to delve into the big discussion. The time is pretty tight, so we have to end soon this session. Just a little bit of housekeeping. There is now no break, but if you want to, if you need to exit the room, now is the moment, quickly, but we are starting right away with the next session from Research to Practice. Now, please, let's thank all the speakers again, and let's wish the Center of Competence in Sustainable Finance a great future.